It's week 8 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what that means. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 8 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, we have 6 teams on bye week here in week 8. So the Cardinals, Lions, Jaguars, Raiders, Rams, and Seahawks all on bye week. Definitely plenty of quarterbacks and tight ends missing here in week 8. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Vikings traveling to face the Chargers. Let's go ahead and start with the Vikings side of things, although we don't exactly know who the starting quarterback is going to be here in week 8 on a short week, as Carson Wentz is dealing with a shoulder issue, and we still have J.J. McCarthy dealing with that ankle issue. But I really don't care who the starting quarterback here is. I don't see a massive amount of upside for either player, even in super flex formats, double quarterback formats, Dynasty, where you guys may be actually dealing with issues due to the bye weeks. These are going to be desperation starts at best. The Chargers defense has definitely softened up a little bit, but they're still top 12 against the quarterback position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So yeah, staying away from both Carson Wentz and JJ McCarthy this week, unless you're absolutely extremely desperate. When it comes to TJ Hawkinson, I moved him down in the streaming area. I know for a lot of you guys out there who own him, you may not have better options, but I think it's kind of tough to just call him a start. I know he almost had that touchdown in week 7, would have been his best fantasy performance of the season yet, and he still got 10.3 fantasy points against the Eagles and had 9 targets. So I do think that Hawkinson is a decent start this week, but bear in mind, this is a tough matchup. The Chargers are a top 10 unit against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed. It's a short week. We don't know the quarterback's going to be here. I will say these Thursday night football games here in the 2025 season have been pretty high scoring. So I don't want to look at this as like a bad thing in terms of the short week, but just not feeling great here when it comes to the quarterbacks and tight ends in terms of the Vikings players. Then we move to the Chargers. We have Justin Herbert in the start category here in week 8 after he had a massive performance in week 7, 29.9 fantasy points, 3 passing touchdowns. Did have 2 interceptions, but he threw for over 400 passing yards and had 31 rushing yards. So I feel good about Herbert. I think there's still kind of this area where between weeks 2 and 6, he had no more than 18.7 fantasy points. He's only had more than that in weeks 1 and 7. Plus, last week they were playing from behind, trying to keep up with the Colts, throwing the football a ton. He had 55 passing attempts, a season high. I don't think that's really going to be the case here at home against the Vikings in week 8, but I still think he's a very solid start overall. So, it is a tough matchup. The Vikings, have been good against opposing quarterbacks, but I think with all the bye weeks, everything going on, let's just go ahead and call Justin Herbert a start because the floor is still pretty safe here. Then we look to the tight end position. Really, the only player we need to mention here is not Will Dissly. It's not Tyler Conklin. It's Oronde Gadsden, the rookie tight end who had 29.4 fantasy points in week 7, 9 targets, 7 catches, 164 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And you guys have heard me in previous videos before week 7 talk about Gadsden. As a matter of fact, our week 7 stash video going into the weekend, we talked about picking up Gadsden before this matchup against the Colts. And I think moving forward, he'll be a good streaming option. Once again, I don't know if the passing volume is going to be necessarily too high this week for the Chargers overall, so I don't know if we're going to see like a ton of output. Plus, he's still competing for targets with Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, and Keenan Allen. But we do know that the Chargers right now need to throw before they run the football because Kamani Vidal, Hassan Haskins, not just that effective of a backfield unless they're playing a defense like the Miami Dolphins. So Gadsden, a very good streaming option, sitting around 11% rostered at the time I'm recording this. That will move up once this waiver period goes through. So maybe by the time you guys watch this, he's more highly rostered, right? But still, this is a player who's definitely worth streaming here in week 8 of the season. All right, moving into Sunday's action. Let's start with the early window. No overseas games, no early morning games. We're starting with a normal schedule here in week 8. So let's start with the Dolphins traveling to face the Falcons. Tua Tagovailoa, 6 interceptions in the past 2 weeks, another 3 interception game in week 7 on the road against the Browns, 1.6 fantasy points we cannot consider Tua a streamer by any stretch. This is just a player we are sitting flat out, and this is not that much better of a matchup this week, as the Falcons are second overall against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. The Browns are third, the team he faced this past week, so this is an even worse matchup. Tua is not in the mix here. I guess if Darren Waller is active and healthy, he's still worth streaming, but once again, this is not a good matchup for the tight end position. The Falcons have allowed the fewest fantasy points to the tight end position on the year so far, so I don't feel great about Waller, but because he gets that red zone involvement when he is healthy, he's in the streaming category as long as he plays this week, but he is considered week to week right now with that pec injury, so we'll see what happens. Michael Penix is technically questionable going into this week, but I think he's going to be good to go. Would be very interesting to see Kirk Cousins get a start this season, assuming that he is the true quarterback 2 here for the Falcons, but I think regardless if it is Michael Penix, he's just a sit for me. We've had him primarily as a sit throughout the season. I know he's having like these random games, week 1, week 4, where he's pretty solid, 19 or more fantasy points in those matchups, but you can't risk the floor. The floor is very, very unsafe with Michael Penix. 14 or less fantasy points in the last 2 games. He has 2 games on the season with 5.7 or less fantasy points. I just want nothing to do with Michael Penix. I know it's not necessarily a bad matchup here going up against the Dolphins, but bear in mind, I mean, Dylan Gabriel, it wasn't a bad matchup last week for him, and he had an awful fantasy day. So I think that the Falcons are going to come out here. They're going to run the football a ton. They're going to use a lot of Bijan Robinson, a lot of Tyler Algier, not a lot of passing upside here for Michael Penix and the Falcons. So he's a sit for me, but Kyle Pitts will remain a streaming option, and that's just kind of where I have him on a week-to-week basis. Good enough matchup here. Dolphins are bottom 10 against opposing tight ends. And yeah, Pitts is going to be sporadic. We look at the last 3 weeks, 18 fantasy points, 4.8, 13.2. Like, you never know exactly what you're going to get, but it is a good matchup. He did have 10 targets this past week. So if you got nothing better, Kyle Pitts, a solid streamer here in week 8. All right, last week we headed straight to Underdog to take the lower on Tua, and guess what? Here in week 8 against the Falcons, I'm also going to head straight to Underdog to take the lower on Tua's total passing touchdowns. This is the second best team in the league against opposing quarterbacks. They've only given up a total of 7 total passing touchdowns to quarterbacks so far on the season. So I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the lower on Tua's total passing touchdowns. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards week 8 NFL action. Take that free Pick Em. Take the lower on Tua's total passing touchdowns. If both of those lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, when you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH, Underdog is also going to give you $50 in bonus cash once you play through $5 on Underdog. And on top of that, they're also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 8 exclusive NFL offers. Moving along, we got the Bears who will travel to face the Ravens. Let's start with Caleb Williams and the Bears. Really bad performance out of Caleb this past week. 5.6 fantasy points, 172 yards through the air, was 15 of 26, 1 interception. And he had 2 fumbles. Neither of them were lost fumbles, but still it doesn't help us in fantasy, right? So I'm leaving Caleb in the start category, and maybe that's a bit unfair. Maybe he should be a little bit lower here, but this is just a good matchup. The Ravens have given up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season, so this is a good bounce back spot for Caleb Williams. Plus, the Bears defense has improved over the past few weeks, but I still feel like this is going to be one of those games, as long as Lamar Jackson is healthy, that we do see some points scored by both teams, a bit of a competitive game script here, so I think that Caleb Williams will need to be involved and be throwing the football, as bad as this run defense is for the Ravens, and knowing that the Bears have been running the football a lot the last 2 weeks with success. I still think Caleb Williams is definitely very startable in this matchup, especially with all the teams on bye week. Colston Loveland, 5.4 fantasy points this past week. Cole Kmet, 2.6. Nothing here from a fantasy perspective. Can't trust these Bears tight ends. All right, At the time I'm recording this, we don't know if Lamar Jackson is going to play here in week 8 of the season or not. We don't really know how much practice he's going to get in this week. It's still early in the week at the time I'm recording this. So if he plays, yes, you start Lamar Jackson. If he's deemed healthy and good to go, you want him in your starting lineup. And that's obviously going to impact every other Ravens player here in week 8, if Lamar plays or not. So I think Mark Andrews is still a solid start. I know he's been pretty disappointing in his past 2 starts with 6.6 or less fantasy points, but we didn't have Lamar Jackson in those games. So ultimately, I think as long as Lamar Jackson plays, we can consider Mark Andrews a solid start. Isaiah Likely, we're just not getting enough production. It hasn't happened this year, so he's a sit. If Cooper Rush is a starting quarterback, or Snoop Huntley or Aaron Bailey or anybody else not named Lamar Jackson, they are not going to be in our starting lineups. They are all sits. So we'll see how this one shakes out here in week 8. All right, next up we have the Jets traveling to face the Bengals. Ugh. Okay, let's start with the Jets side of things. Justin Fields, don't know if he's going to be the starting quarterback this week or if it's going to be Tyrod Taylor. Fields got a little bit banged up last week, was able to come back and play, then he got benched. So I don't know who the starting quarterback is going to be, but I'm not really interested in starting either of them. We also don't know at this point in the week the status of Garrett Wilson for the week. Looks like the early reporting is indicating that the Jets are hopeful he will play this week. I think that actually is really important for whoever the starting quarterback is here, because Garrett Wilson is really the only true pass catcher on this team, right? And the other thing here is there's a week 9 bye for the Jets, so for like these players, kind of fringe if they're going to start or not. They may just rest them through the bye week in terms of the quarterback situation. Do they want to wait till after the bye week to make this decision? It's a tough schedule right after the bye. The Browns, the Patriots, the Ravens, and the Falcons. It's a really, really tough 4-week stretch. Then it lightens up a little bit, but still, you can't feel good about the starting quarterback, whoever it is, for the Jets. If you're really, really desperate in a super flex format, double quarterback format, it's a good matchup against the Bengals. So if it is Tyrod Taylor, there's some life there, but I just don't like this situation, especially if Garrett Wilson is out here in week 8. I'm going to go ahead and leave Mason Taylor in the streaming category. I really liked him last week. It did not happen. This offense completely fell apart, and you would think with no Garrett Wilson on the field that they would need to target somebody, but they just couldn't get anything going. He had 5 targets, 3 catches, 31 receiving yards, 6.1 fantasy points. I will say most of those targets came with Tyrod Taylor at the quarterback position, so maybe that gives us some life if Tyrod Taylor is a starter this week. But ultimately, the Bengals have given up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends on it this season. They've given up the most touchdowns to opposing tight ends on the season, with a lead of 3 more than the next highest team, which would coincidentally be the New York Jets, who've given up 6 receiving touchdowns on the season to opposing tight ends. And on top of that, they've also given up the most receiving yards of any team to opposing tight ends by far, with 536. They just got absolutely completely gassed by Pat Freiermuth, Jonnu Smith, and like 3 other Steelers tight ends. So this is a good spot for Mason Taylor. I'm leaving him in the streaming category. It's a tough week with all the bye weeks, so we'll see how it shakes out. Joe Flacco, we're going to go ahead and have as a solid streamer this week. This Jets defense has been a little bit better overall in the past 2 weeks or so, but they're still bottom 10 against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. Flacco as a starter with the Bengals has had 18.7 or more fantasy points, at least 2 passing touchdowns in each of his first 2 starts, and he's thrown the football 45 times or more in each of those first 2 starts. So feel great about Joe Flacco. It's a home game for the Bengals. He's a very, very solid option if you need a streamer at the quarterback position here in week 8. I know Noah Fant got a little bit of involvement this past week in the Unk Bowl. He scored a touchdown. Mike Gesicki is on IR. Shouldn't even be on the screen, or it should at least have an asterisk. I'm sorry, guys. But yeah, I mean, Noah Fant is worth paying attention to, I suppose. And ultimately, this isn't the worst matchup, as the Jets are bottom 10 against opposing tight ends. And like I just said, they've given up quite a few touchdowns, but I just don't really trust it. With Gesicki on IR, that does help Noah Fant, but we'd have to be in a pretty desperate situation to try and take a swing here. Fant has at least 4 targets in each of the 2 games with Joe Flacco, but no more than 4 targets. So the volume's still low. If he doesn't score, you're not going to be in a good place. But maybe a desperation streamer if things are ugly enough for you here in the first of one of the biocalypses of the 2025 fantasy football season. Moving along, we have the Bills fresh off of their bye week traveling to face the Carolina Panthers. Let's start with Josh Allen and company. Josh Allen going to be a start for me. This Panthers defense, they're nothing to sneeze at. They're kind of the strong point of this team right now, and they are top 8 against opposing quarterbacks when it comes to fantasy points scored. And Josh Allen coming off of his second worst fantasy performance back in week 6 against the Falcons, 2 interceptions, 2 fumbles, 17.4 fantasy points, but it's Josh Allen. I'm starting him no matter what if I own him. Don't overthink this one. He's still as good of a start at the quarterback position as you're going to get this week. Now, Dalton Kincaid is day-to-day dealing with that oblique injury still. They're coming off the bye week, so I think there's a good chance he is able to play here in week 8. And while Mason Taylor, who we just talked about, disappointed against the Panthers this past week, they are still a bottom 6 unit against opposing tight ends so far on the season in terms of fantasy points allowed. They were the second worst team behind the Bengals, and they moved back a couple spots here. And they do give up a ridiculous amount of total receptions, although once again, they've kind of moved back in terms of their receptions allowed and receiving yards allowed due to their performance this past week. But this defense's weak point has still been against opposing tight ends. So as long as Dalton Kincaid plays this week, I think he's a solid start. He's still a top 11 fantasy tight end right now, even with missing week 6 and having a bye week in week 7. So he should be solid. He has double digits in every game he's played in this year except for one game. So we'll see if he plays. As long as he's out there, he's good in my lineup. If it's any other Bills tight end this week, Dawson Knox, whoever, we're not starting them. All right. Bryce Young may be the starter this week. He may not be, as he is dealing with an ankle injury, and it could be serious enough that he misses a couple weeks. And I think that the overall consensus is that he's not going to be able to play this week. So it looks like Andy Dalton will be the starting quarterback. Really, regardless, I don't have any interest in starting either of these players here in week 8, even in super flex formats. I just don't feel good here. The Bills, middle of the pack against opposing quarterbacks. So maybe there's something here if you're desperate enough in like super flex territory to pick up Andy Dalton, who should be out there on waivers. But yeah, I just want to stay away from this situation if I can help it. Jatavion Sanders was active for the first time since week 3 this past week. He had 2 targets, 0 catches, was on the field for 37% of snaps. Tommy Tremble on the field for 66% of snaps. He had 1 target, 1 catch that somehow went for 0 yards. So we are not starting any Panthers tight ends under any circumstances here in week 8 of the season. Next up, we have the Niners, who will be traveling to face the Texans. Let's start with the Niners side of things, although it is a big question mark, as it has been for weeks now with this Niners team outside of Christian McCaffrey at the running back position. But yeah, the early indications here is that we still don't have any true status for Brock Purdy here in week 8 of the season. It's not a great matchup against the Texans. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but Purdy still has 18 or more fantasy points in the 2 games he has played this year. So if he starts, he's healthy, then I think you can start him in your starting lineup, especially with all the bye weeks and everything going on. As long as he plays, I think he has a decent floor this week, but the upside is definitely capped due to the other injuries on this team. In fact, that is not a great matchup on the road here. George Kittle, what happened this past week? He was active, had 2 targets, but 0 catches. Well, the game plan was obviously run the football with Christian McCaffrey. Kittle was very impactful in this game, great in terms of run blocking, as expected, as he usually is. I just didn't really get that involvement in the passing game, but it's National Tight End Week this week. Don't forget that, guys. And George Kittle usually has a pretty good week when it is National Tight End Week. He was still on the field for 81% of snaps compared to Jake Tunges, who was on the field for just 12% of snaps. So if you guys own Kittle, I think it's perfectly fine to leave him in the start category here in week 8 of the season. If it's Mac Jones at quarterback, just no thank you. I mean, he's really come back to earth after having some pretty solid starts, but just 6 fantasy points this past week in a tough matchup against the Falcons. The only team who's given up fewer fantasy points than the Falcons to quarterbacks is the Texans, so I'm going to leave Mac Jones as a stay-away sit. All right, CJ Stroud is also going to be just a sit for me. Listen, had a good game against the Titans. They are not good against quarterbacks. They have an awful pass defense. Had a good game against the Ravens. They are god-awful against quarterbacks and have an awful pass defense right now. So I didn't have super high expectations in week 7. I felt like he was maybe a decent streamer. He did throw the football 49 times, just 23 completions, 229 passing yards, a touchdown and a pick, 25 yards on the ground. Now Nico Collins dealing with a concussion issue. This is not good. CJ Stroud is just going to be a sit for me. The 49ers aren't fantastic against quarterbacks, but they're certainly not bad, 13th overall. But I'm just staying away from CJ Stroud. And if you guys have been watching for majority of the season, I've had Stroud as a sit every single week except for week 5 against the Ravens. I'm just not feeling it. And with Nico Collins going down, things look much worse here. But I will say Dalton Schultz has been impacted pretty beneficially by the Nico Collins injury, and even before that was playing okay, but 18.8 fantasy points in week 7, 10 targets, 9 catches, 98 receiving yards. So if you need to stream a tight end this week who might be out there on waivers, he's 18% rostered at the time of recording this. Once again, the Niners middle of the pack against tight ends, so I think that this is a decent spot for Dalton Schultz. You should see an increase in volume because there's not a lot of pass catchers on this Texans team right now. We'll see if Christian Kirk plays in week 8, but he also missed this past week as well, being banged up. So Schultz should be a solid streaming option as we move into the weekend. Next up, we have the Browns, who will be traveling to face the Patriots. So let's start with the Browns side of things. Dylan Gabriel, that first start was maybe looking like he could be a streaming option at times. In the past 2 weeks, have definitely made me strongly reconsider that. Patriots top 10 against opposing quarterbacks. Gabriel was 13 of 18 this past week, 116 passing yards, 5.8 fantasy points. He hasn't thrown a touchdown since week 5 when he got that first start. He hasn't had any turnovers, so that's good, I guess, but I don't feel good about the Browns this week at all. This is a tough Patriots defense. They're at home. I just do not feel good about the Browns offense this week. So I'm definitely going to have Dylan Gabriel as a sit. I think you can still stream either tight end here. David Njoku's week to week. I have a strong feeling that Njoku will not play this week because the Browns have a week 9 bye week. So I do think that is good news for Harold Fannin, who had 5 targets, 4 catches, 36 receiving yards this past week, has had 11 or more fantasy points in 2 of the last 3 games, and seems to have a good chemistry with Dylan Gabriel. So I think Fannin is definitely streamable. As good as his Patriots defense has been, they're still bottom 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to tight end. So Fannin is a solid streamer this week, especially if David Njoku misses this week, which it's looking like he has a strong chance to miss. All right. Drake May has been super good. We talked a lot about Drake May going into week 7. I had him as one of my must-start quarterbacks. If you guys watched Saturday night's video, 21 of 23, 222 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 62 yards on the ground, 23 fantasy points. He now has 20 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 on the season so far. And really look to last week, like, the Patriots just got to a point where they really didn't need to throw the football a ton more. Ramondre Stevenson was having a lot of success running the football for the most part. So that was one thing I talked about last week that might kind of cap his upside, but still very solid performance. And I know this is a tough matchup this week against the Cleveland Browns, but this is a home game for the Patriots, and I don't really see how right now you can bench Drake May if you own him. But bear in mind, he gets the Browns this week and the Falcons in the following week, So there are 2 tough matchups coming up here, so maybe his upside is a bit capped, but he's still a solid start. Hunter Henry just living in that streaming area. We have seen some of that upside kind of dissipate here. Not as many red zone looks, not as many touchdowns, even with the Patriots throwing the football a ton, one of the pass heaviest teams in the league. So he lives in the streaming category. It's a not great matchup against the Browns this week, but if you have nothing better, you can always cross your fingers and go ahead and roll with Hunter Henry. All right, final game in the early window is going to be the Giants traveling to face the Eagles for a little rematch of what we just got on Thursday Night Football 2 weeks ago. Let's start with Jackson Dart and company. Jackson Dart looking pretty dang good. This was a player I talked or have talked about in the past few waiver videos, but this past week, like Jackson Dart just needs to be rostered in single quarterback formats at this point. 29 fantasy points on the road against the Broncos, 15 of 33, 283 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a pick, and had a rushing touchdown towards the end of the game. And I know like he didn't really do as much in the second half as he did in the first half, but still, this was a solid performance from a fantasy perspective, and he's had 17.5 or more fantasy points in every start this week. The last time he played the Eagles 2 weeks ago, 23.6 fantasy points. Now, I will say, like, this is still a tough stretch coming up for the Giants. I've talked about this a lot. Eagles, Niners, Bears, Packers, Lions, Patriots, and he has had success towards the beginning of this stretch against the Eagles and the Broncos, but this is still a really tough defensive stretch overall for these Giants starters. So at some point I could see some of this upside for guys like Dart and Scatabo and Robinson going down a bit, but until we see it, we got to consider these guys strong starts. So Jackson Dart remaining in the start category, even on the road against the Eagles this weekend. I know a lot of people think this Eagles defense and they get really, really like worried and worked up, but Eagles 16th overall in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They've struggled against other positions ultimately on the season so far, so not too overreactive to this matchup. Now, the tight end position has benefited from the success of Jackson Dart over the past few weeks. Theo Johnson this past week, 15.6 fantasy points. He's had 10 or more fantasy points in 3 of the 4 games with Jackson Dart as a starting quarterback and 4 touchdowns in that stretch. So I think he's a good streaming option. The one position that the Eagles are playing well against is the tight end position. So bear that in mind. They are top 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to tight ends, but overall, I think he's worth a stream at the end of the day if you have nothing better. But once again, keep in mind, his only game with single digits with Dart at quarterback was week 6 against the Eagles. But Daniel Bellinger showed up kind of out of nowhere this past week. He had a touchdown, 4 targets, 3 catches, 17.8 fantasy points, but 88 receiving yards on top of that as well. So I don't want to overreact too much here. With Dart at quarterback, he has gotten some more involvement. Also had 4 targets in week 5, but like he had 0 targets in week 6 against Philly. So just not as consistent. It seems like Theo Johnson's the number 1 guy at tight end here. He's played about 20% more of the snaps, so I'm just not going to consider Bellinger this week. Way too risky, even with all the bye weeks. All right, Jalen Hurts, you just start him every single week. I've been saying it week after week. I still get a lot of questions about Jalen Hurts. If you own him, you start him, and thank God we got another game script this past week where the Eagles needed to throw the football, and I think just ultimately, overall, they need to throw the football more. Hurts was 19 of 23, 326 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a really solid game through the air for him. He ended up with negative 10 rushing yards, which is strange for Jalen Hurts, but is what it is. He still had 24 fantasy points. So you look on the season, he has 19.4 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 2 against the Chiefs. So if you own Jalen Hurts, you just simply keep rolling with them, and the Giants are bottom 5 against the quarterback position in terms of fantasy points allowed. You got to feel good if you own Hurts. Don't overthink it. And when it comes to Dallas Goedert, I think you just keep him in your starting lineup. I know it was tough this past week, 4.8 fantasy points. His first game without a touchdown since week 3. His only game on the season without double-digit fantasy points. But I still think Goedert has to be a solid start overall. The Giants, not bad against tight ends, but Goedert has been one of the better fantasy tight ends on the entirety of the season. So I would just keep him in your starting lineup, and don't forget his best game of the season yet came week 6 against the Giants when he had 26 fantasy points. All right, moving into the afternoon window, we're going to have the Buccaneers traveling to face the New Orleans Saints. And let's start with Baker Mayfield, his worst fantasy performance of the season yet on the road against the Lions. I mean, if you guys watched this game, it was just not the Buccaneers' night. I mean, nothing was working. The Lions had a ton of defensive injuries, but they really showed up big time. A great game plan by the Lions and their coaching staff. And listen, I think that Baker's going to be able to bounce back this week. It looks like Mike Evans is set to miss a fair amount of time here, if not the entirety of the season, almost most of the season. We still have Chris Godwin injured. He's probably not going to play this week, especially with the week 9 bye week. So I do think that there's going to be a push for Emeka Egbuka to play. I think he could pop up on the injury report, but he was able to play week 7, still had 12 targets, 4 catches. We have Cade Otton looming around. Guys like Tez Johnson have been able to step up. We might get Bucky Irving back this week. I mean, Ultimately, there's still a lot of issues in terms of injuries with this team, but I think that Baker Mayfield can bounce back here in week 8 of the season. It's a much looser defense, as the Saints have been bottom 10 against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. So I still think Baker a solid start, and he'll be much, much better than what we got this past week against the Lions. And I think due to all these injuries to pass catchers, wide receivers still happening with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you have to continue to look at Cade Otton as a solid streaming option on a week-to-week basis, maybe even a little bit higher. The Saints come in 19th overall against opposing tight ends, so it's not a bad matchup here. And Otton has had at least 5 targets in 3 straight games with a ceiling of 9 targets this past week, including 7 catches for 65 receiving yards. So I think that Baker is going to continue to try and get the football to Cade Otton because he doesn't really have a lot of other options, right? So in terms of players he can truly trust on every down. So I do think that Cade Otton is a very good streamer here in week 8. Then we move to the Saints side of things. Spencer Rattler just going to continue to be a sit for me. Only has more than 16 fantasy points in 1 game this year, and he did throw 2 touchdowns this past week, so there's that. But you know, even with this being a decent matchup against the Bucs, who are 20th overall against quarterbacks, come on, I just don't feel good about Spencer Rattler, and I don't think that I need to break it down much further than that. Jawan Johnson, we'll put him in the streaming category because he had 12.9 fantasy points this past week, and the Bucs are 18th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to tight ends. But yeah, 7 targets, 5 catches, 79 receiving yards after being pretty non-existent for 3 straight weeks. So with all the bye weeks and everything, Jawan Johnson may have been dropped in your league as he had those 3 bad games in a row. He is at least a decent streamer here in week 8 of the season. Moving along, we have the Titans traveling to face the Colts in what may be the most lopsided matchup here in week 8. Cam Ward going to continue to be a sit for me, as he has been a sit every single week of the season. He has an interception in every game since week 3 of the season, and he has 3 lost fumbles in the past 2 weeks. You can't feel good here. The Colts haven't been fantastic against opposing quarterbacks, but come on, you just can't feel good here. There's nothing else to say. Even in Superflex, you might as well just start a wide receiver, running back, or tight end in that Superflex spot if Cam Ward is all you have. Chicken Conquo, he got some involvement in week 6, and I told you guys this is still not a streamer for me. He had 0 fantasy points in week 7, 2 targets, 0 catches, and once again, it doesn't really matter like what the rankings are or anything here. You just can't feel good about any of the Titans' offensive starters, and the Colts have been really bad against tight ends and wide receivers. Even with all the success they've had this year in terms of fantasy points allowed, they've struggled against those 2 positions, but I don't care. I don't want any Titans starting offensive player in my lineup. This is going to be a big day for the Colts, and we'll just leave it at that. When it comes to the Colts, I'm still starting Daniel Jones. I know we've kind of gone back and forth a little bit, here, in terms of like stream him. Is he a starter? But in the past 2 weeks, he's been nothing but a starter with 22 or more fantasy points, at least 2 passing touchdowns in each of those games, and at least 1 rushing touchdown in the last 2 weeks as well. The Titans are just a bad overall unit when it comes to defending the pass. They rank relatively high, top 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, but they have given up a lot of total yardage to opposing quarterbacks, and they're very weak against opposing wide receivers, and they are very weak against the running back position. So I could see the game script here impacting Danny Dimes this week to where his ceiling's not as high. You look back to week 3 against the Titans on the road, Daniel Jones only had 15 fantasy points, and in that game, Jonathan Taylor had 32.8 fantasy points and 3 rushing touchdowns. So don't get me wrong, there could be a capped ceiling here or maybe a lower overall performance for Daniel Jones, but it's hard to call him anything other than a start right now. And Tyler Warren undisputedly is a start every single week. We're looking at double-digit fantasy points in every game this year except for week 3. Coincidentally, against Tennessee, but still, he's starting to find the end zone, get red zone looks. He has a touchdown in 3 straight games. If you own Tyler Warren, there's no debate here. He is a must-start tight end here in week 8. All right, to wrap up the afternoon window, we got a good one between the Cowboys and the Broncos. Let's start with Dak Prescott and company, and Dak has been as solid as it comes when we look at the quarterback position over the past 4 weeks, 4 straight games with at least 3 passing touchdowns and 22 or more fantasy points with a ceiling of 30 fantasy points in week 4. So you got to feel great about Dak Prescott if you own him, but I will say it's a tough matchup here. I never like when teams have to travel to Denver and play, although the Giants fared pretty well this past week, but I still don't like that atmosphere. And ultimately, the Broncos have still given up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I could see a situation here where it's not Dak's best week, especially with all the success he's had for 4 straight games. And really, I mean, you look at 5 of the last 6, he's had 22 or more fantasy points. So I can see this being a lower overall game for Dak Prescott, but it's hard to call him anything other than a start. And once again, the Broncos defense still wasn't great last week against Jackson Dart and company. And when it comes to Jake Ferguson, I was, early in the season pounding the table for you guys to pick up Jake Ferguson, for you guys to start Ferguson every week. And I think at this point, we've realized Jake Ferguson is a must-start tight end no matter what. Since week 4 of the season, we're looking at 6 receiving touchdowns, double digits in every single game. This past week, 7 targets, 7 catches, only 29 receiving yards, but 2 receiving touchdowns. I mean, it doesn't matter who he's going up against. I know, once again, this isn't a great matchup against the Broncos defense, 8th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to the tight end position, but this is your tight end 1 in both full and half PPR. Whether CeeDee Lamb is active, healthy or not, it doesn't matter. Jake Ferguson is a vocal point of this offense. He is a start no matter what. Then we move to the Broncos side of things. Bo Nix going to remain in the start category, and that's not just because he's coming off of his best fantasy day yet. It's also because this is just a fantastic matchup. The Cowboys have allowed the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season so far. They're bottom 5 against running backs. They've given up the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, and they're okay against tight ends overall, but we just know that this is a smash matchup. It's a home game for the Broncos. Don't even worry about the past couple weeks. I know there's been a little bit of inconsistency here, but still, Bo Nix is going to be a very, very solid start. Yeah, like I said, 27 of 50 this past week, 279 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 48 yards on the ground, and 2 rushing touchdowns, his best performance of the season. This is going to be another very good performance here in week 8. Then we look to Evan Ingram, has slowly started to get more and more involvement, 6 or more targets in the last 4 games, a season high of 8 targets this past week, 5 catches, 42 receiving yards. So he's in that streaming tier. Has only had 9.9 or less fantasy points in the last 2 games. Has only hit double digits once on the season, but he's streamable. Once again, technically the strongest part of this Cowboys defense when it comes to fantasy points allowed is against the tight end position, but still, Ingram, streamable, maybe not my favorite, but in a game that should have a fair amount of points scored, he's a solid option as we approach the weekend. All right, Sunday Night Football, we're going to have the Packers traveling to face the Steelers. Let's start with the Packers side of things. I left Jordan Love in the start category, but I don't particularly think he has a ton of upside here in week 8, but I know with the bye weeks and everything, some of you guys are going to need some more options, and this is a good matchup. The Steelers defense has been struggling. They're bottom 5 against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed, so I could see this being a decent game for Jordan Love, but yeah, just 1 passing touchdown in each of the past 2 games, has only had more than 20 fantasy points in 2 games on the season, has only thrown for 2 passing touchdowns in 3 games on the season, and we just never know when it's going to be one of these Josh Jacobs games. I mean, some of them more predictable than others, like when he was playing the Bengals, right? But then we've also seen games like week 4 where Josh Jacobs was incredibly involved and Jordan Love still had a solid game there. So I don't know. Josh Jacobs, 2 rushing touchdowns in 3 straight games. It's still a good matchup for him as well. So, yeah, I just don't know exactly what the upside is with Jordan Love, and the floor isn't great, but it's a good matchup here against the Steelers. This Sunday Night Football, I think Jordan Love is at least solid this week, but maybe not my favorite player in the start category. Tucker Kraft has been great. Another tight end here who I've really encouraged you guys since the beginning of the season to just start every week and feel good about. And he's been super solid with a touchdown in every game on the season except for 2. 16.8 fantasy points this past week. 5 receptions off of 10 targets, 58 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So been super good. And once again, the Steelers have struggled. This defense is just not playing well right now. They're bottom 5 against opposing tight ends on the season. So if you own Tucker Kraft, don't question it. He is still a very good start here in week 8 of the season. I'm going to leave Aaron Rodgers in the streaming category, 17.5 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. We had him as a streaming option this past week, came through against the Bengals with 24.5 fantasy points, 4 passing touchdowns. And ultimately, I think he's worth a stream here in week 8 of the season. I know it's the Packers defense, but they've been a bit wishy-washy, and they're still only 19th overall against opposing quarterbacks. So it's a pretty good overall matchup. Once again, Sunday Night Football could be a good game script here. So Rodgers is streamable, especially since a lot of you guys need some other options. Now, Johnny Smith, Pat Freiermuth, I went a bit back and forth on because his volume is really difficult to call on a week-to-week basis. Like, I would feel a lot more worried about Pat Freiermuth. Even though he had 2 receiving touchdowns this past week, this was his only game on the season with more than 4 targets, and it was against the worst team in the league against tight ends in the Cincinnati Bengals. And then this was only Johnny Smith's second game this past week, which is what I'm referring to here, where he had more than 4 targets, and he did score a touchdown, but only had 3 catches. And once again, it was against the Bengals, the worst team in the league against opposing tight ends. But in terms of fantasy points allowed, the Packers are now the second worst team in the league against opposing tight ends, so I can't really call them sits. And the Packers have given up 5 total receiving touchdowns to tight ends, which is the 3rd most in the league, only behind the Bengals and the New York Jets. So ultimately, I still think this is a good spot for the Steelers tight ends, but it's really difficult to call what the volume is going to look like, if Freiermuth is going to be involved again or if he's not going to be involved again. And don't forget, Darnell Washington has had 5 targets in 2 straight games and scored a touchdown this past week. So he's getting involvement as well. So it's just kind of like they're utilizing all these tight ends in this Arthur Smith system. And then Connor Hayward is on the field at times as well. And he has had a touchdown in the past 2 weeks in week 6 against the Browns. So thanks, Arthur Smith, for this complete headache. But yeah, it's a good matchup, but it's risky. We don't know what the volume is going to look like. Tough to call these guys sits, though, as we move into week 8. All right, let's wrap it up with Monday Night Football. Just one game this week. It'll be the Washington Commanders traveling to face the Kansas City Chiefs in Arrowhead. And right now, the time I'm recording this early in the week, don't know if Jaden Daniels is going to be able to play here in week 8 or not as he deals with that hamstring issue. This is tough here, and I'm going to leave Jaden Daniels in the start category, even if he starts, but I'm a little worried about Jaden Daniels if he is a starter here. The Chiefs are top 5 against opposing quarterbacks. Never like when teams have to travel to Arrowhead. The Chiefs' defense has looked a bit better over the past few weeks. So Jaden Daniels will be a starter due to the fact that he's Jaden Daniels, but if he does play, I'm a little bit worried here. If it's Marcus Mariota, he's just a sit for me. I know he's been serviceable throughout the season as a streamer with 17 or more fantasy points in each of the 2 games that he started, but then this past week he struggled, kind of on the fly there against the Dallas Cowboys, and once again, it's just a bad matchup. I don't feel great here. If Marcus Mariota is a starter, I don't even want to call him a streaming option in Superflex. Zach Ertz just remains in the start category, though. He's had a touchdown in each of the past 2 games, and that was with Jaden Daniels at quarterback, and ultimately he's been better with Jaden Daniels at quarterback in every game that Jaden Daniels has played in this year, except for week 5 against the Chargers where Zach Ertz completely disappeared. Ertz has had a touchdown, so I like him a lot more if JD5 is the starter, but ultimately, he's just one of these tight ends. You kind of roll with what you get. Maybe you have another option that we went over in this video that you feel is better if, JD5 does not play this week. That's fine, but I still think for the most part, even in a tough matchup here, Ertz is a solid start. Then we look to Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, the Kansas City Chiefs. Early in the season, I was really trying to deflate kind of like the worry that a lot of you guys had about Mahomes and the Chiefs offense, and I think at this point, you guys feel pretty good. Mahomes is the QB1 in fantasy, 3 passing touchdowns in 2 straight games, 26 or more fantasy points in every game since week 4. You got to feel good if you own Mahomes. Gets the Commanders defense this week that has really fallen back in rankings. Bottom 10 against opposing quarterbacks. It's a great spot for Patrick Mahomes. There's just really no debate here. If you guys own Mahomes, he's a must-start quarterback. Then, the Commanders kind of right there in the middle, 17th overall against tight ends, but certainly not great. And I will say, Travis Kelce just 3 targets, 3 catches this past week. We're seeing, all the, Chiefs wide receivers healthy now. Rashee Rice back from his suspension. Got Xavier Worthy, Juju Smith-Schuster, Hollywood Brown, Tyquan Thornton, ultimately, and even some volume to Brashard Smith at the running back position in terms of passing volume there. 5 targets this past week. So there's a lot of players here. Andy Reid likes to spread the football around, do a lot of different things. And Travis Kelce is starting to potentially have the least amount of benefit from that, especially the return of Rashee Rice. So I'm going to leave him in the star category, still at 8.4 fantasy points this past week. Not good by any stretch, but could have been a lot worse for just 3 total targets. So still startable here, still one of these tight ends that you can kind of just roll with the punches, take what you get. Tight end 5 in PPR, tight end 6 in half PPR. So still a very startable player, but once again, maybe you guys have better options who may have more upside as we approach week 8. And there you guys have it. Every single game, every single matchup, every single quarterback and tight end, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting as we approach week 8 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So make sure you guys drop any fantasy questions that you have as we approach week 8. I'll answer as many of you guys as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 8 fantasy content. We have everything that you guys could possibly need here on the channel to absolutely dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.